Hello, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Royal Photographic Society's Historical Group and this latest in a series of collections and archive talks. This evening, we're very pleased to welcome Cally Blackman, who's going to be talking to us not from a specific archive this time, but from a group of material that she's brought together in a rather wonderful book that we'll hear about later on. So just as a very short introduction, Cally studied fashion design in the early 1970s and now teaches fashion history and theory at Central St Martin's in London. And she's author of a number of important books on fashion history and design, of which her book on the Autochrome, fashion and Autochrome, is the latest. So and that's what we'll be hearing about this evening. So Cally, I'm going to hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Can you hear me okay? I'm very pleased and honoured to have been asked to give this talk tonight. And given the date today, I'm more than a little nervous because it has been so difficult, really, and possibly foolish to try and condense my book into 45 minutes. So I'm just going to skate over the surface of the text and focus on showing you as many beautiful autochromes as I have been able to squeeze in to give you a taste of the book in the time that we have. So here goes. Oops, sorry. Moving on. I wanted to begin by briefly tracing the story of my fascination with and love of autochromes. I first became aware of them in 2008 when the BBC broadcast a series about Albert Kahn's Archives de la Planète. I was transfixed, and from that moment I began to hunt down everything I could to find out more, from key texts such as Pamela Roberts' A Century of Colour Photography and John Wood's publications and others. And I was also lucky enough to get some funding from Central St Martin's, where I teach, that enabled me to make several research trips in the UK, to Paris and America over the years. I came to know the collection at the Musée Albert Kahn very well, where I was absolutely blown away by this incredible archive of over 72,000 autochromes, all of which have been digitized. Many of them of people around the world wearing indigenous dress, as well as the portraits of his hundreds of international visitors, mostly wearing Western European fashion. And it was through this one image from the Kahn archive that, in my view, I demonstrated the autochrome's worth as hard evidence of the colour of clothes in a peer-reviewed journal article published in 2014. My research into the indigenous dress of the people who lived in the Cladda, a small settlement near Galway City in the west of Ireland, proved the unique ability of the autochrome to represent colour as accurately as was possible at the time. And not only that, but also, as you can see here, its ability to differentiate between the hues of colour, the different reds, for example, the crimson of the Galway cloak, not, as Marguerite Mespellet, one of Kahn's operators, was led to believe, the Cladda cloak, which in fact was blue. So the crimson of the Galway cloak contrasting with the scarlet of the flannel petticoat. Around the same time, sometime I think about 2008, I also came across the amazing Salon du Goût Français, held in the archive of the Conservatoire attached to the Musée des Arts et Métiers in Paris. But despite my best efforts, I couldn't access this extraordinary collection for another 10 years until 2018, when I was able to view the online database on an old Dell computer in the Conservatoire's library. I was absolutely astonished. Of over 2,000 autochromes of luxury French commodities, from cars to furniture, taken to promote France's exports after the war and reinforce trade with its colonies, most are of fashion, from haute couture by vaunted Parisian houses to ready-to-wear clothing and accessories, none of which had been used to illustrate fashion history before. and I'm going to talk a little bit more about the Salon later on. So my book was finally published last week after 15 years of research and brings together in some sort of coherent form, I hope, images from these and many other sources in order to tell the story of fashion in colour through the lens of the Autochrome from its launch in 1907 to its demise in the early 1930s. It features approximately 370 illustrations, the majority autochromes, of course, plus some complementary images. And at this point, I have to thank my publisher and especially the reproduction department for the wonderful job they have done with the notoriously tricky business of reproducing autochromes in print. It's really beautiful. It's divided into several sections, which I'm going to briefly describe, beginning with, of course, an introduction. And I begin by comparing autochromes and fashion history. As a colour photographic process, the autochrome was marginalised in the historiography of photography until the 70s, as was fashion history until it was established as an academic discipline, an offshoot of art history at the Courtauld Institute in 1965 to aid the dating of paintings. Both had until then been regarded as flou, a negative term in photography for a hazy, out-of-focus image, and also a term in fashion vernacular for an atelier traditionally made up of women who specialized in sewing light, flimsy fabrics, as opposed to the male-dominated tailleur or tailoring atelier, historically a gendered division in the fashion industry. One could say that both color photography and fashion history, inevitably associated with fashion, or the F word, as I like to call it, are still regarded by some, to some extent, as superficial and secondary to more serious formats and subjects. There is, of course, a problem with colour that goes back to ancient classical times, as David Batchelor so brilliantly explains in his book Chromophobia. Colore was regarded as secondary to monochrome disegno or drawing and long associated with artificiality and primitivism. For example, as the expert collector of autochromes Mark Jacobs suggested to me in an email before his sad death, the colours of autochromes were heightened in the printing process by National Geographic magazine to emphasize the exotic, primitive nature of indigenous people in its travel reportage. And of course, another big problem is that we all see colour differently. But at a time when the representation of garments in colour was in many cases clumsy, arbitrary and completely untrustworthy, the autochrome affords a reliable register of colour because of its internal technology and its inability to be edited or tweaked after the plate was taken out of the camera. So not only is the autochrome, a robust register of colour, but also of the haptic qualities, the textures of materials and fabrics, as is so evident in this portrait of Ethel Prague, whose soft cotton corduroy jacket is clearly shown and almost tangible in its tactility. And as I so often find when discussing fashion history, my previous statement is immediately disproved by my next images, taken by Edward Steichen in full pictorialist mode. They are so flou that it is difficult even to read the details of the garments that his friend, fellow photographer, and member of the photo secession group, Charlotte Albright, wears. As is the case with Heinrich Kuhn's exercise in the hazy effects of light and shade in his autochrome of Mary Warner in Twilight, who is wearing a white muslin dress, one of the photo clothes that Kuhn kept for use in his photography. So in this section, I have included, as well as examples by pictorialist photographers, autochromes taken by artists and of artists. On the right here, we have the Russian author Leonid Andreev, an avid autochromist who wears some very contemporary looking summer linen at his extraordinary house on the Finnish-Russian border at Vamalsuu. I think I've pronounced that correctly, but I'm not too sure. And here we have Gustav Klimt and his partner Emily Floger wearing reform dress or reform kleid as it was called whilst they were on holiday in Attersee. He in a linen smock with folk motifs embroidered on the shoulders, and she in a so-called hanging dress, probably designed in collaboration with Klimt, with a panel of folk embroidery at the front of the kind she collected and exhibited in her couture salon in Vienna. She also wears a necklace by the designer Koloman Moser, who was associated with the Wiener Werkstätte, that was given to her by Klimt as a Christmas present in 1903. And of course, I had to include this famous autochrome of Selma Schubert, Alfred Stieglitz's sister, wearing a Delphos dress designed by Mariano Fortuny, a polymath who experimented with the autochrome process himself, although the example on the right was actually taken probably by Jean Deboutin for the Photocouleur studio in Paris, a studio originally set up by Gervais Cotellemont that specialized in the autochrome process. My next section is called Autochromiste because many of the best autochromists were women, some of whom ran successful studios, such as Sarah Angelina Ackland and Olive Edis on the right here, who wears a two-piece ensemble made in a Liberty print fabric, edged with turquoise piping, as she sits on the windowsill of her studio in Sheringham in Norfolk. I also feature Edis's contemporary Kate Buchler. I'm sorry, I don't speak German. I'm not sure if that's right or not. A German photographer, better known for her monochrome series on women in men's jobs taken during the First World War, but who began to work with autochromes from 1913 and recorded the social life of the small city of Braunschweig, where she lived, although this example is actually taken on a visit to London. Helen Messenger Murdoch is included, of course, and also lesser-known practitioners such as Louise Deglan and a Mrs. Benjamin Russell, who is known only by her husband's name, as Mark Jacobs also highlighted on his website, but who is a brilliant autochromist. And I think much more research, as he suggested, needs to be done on the subject of these talented women. So after these thematic sections, I continue with a general overview of fashion up to 1919, starting with another star find of autochromes. Is this, yes, no. Which was a series taken by an unknown photographer or photographers for the Paris couture house of Jacques Doucet that is in the collection of the Musée des Arts Décoratifs. And a couple of them were in the exhibition on photography that was held a few years ago there. So these are amazing. Their pin-sharp focus, brilliantly intense color, and incredible representation of the texture of luxurious fabrics, such as the silk velvet you see here, used by this illustrious couture maison, is incredible. The plates were donated to the museum by the renowned couturier Madeleine Vionnet in the early 1950s, who began her career designing at the House of Doucet. And this, incidentally, is where I begin to obsess over props and backdrops and bits of furniture. But that's a rabbit hole down which I'm not going to go today, tempting as it is. The Rothschild archive of Autochromes, taken by Lionel de Rothschild, also proved fruitful, not only as proof that vibrant colours were worn at this period, as well as the stereotypical sweet pea pastels often associated with the era, but they also demonstrate the usefulness of the autochrome, somewhat ironically, as an indicator of mourning dress, something that is very difficult to ascertain in monochrome photography. Gustave Gain's portraits of his family at leisure on the Brittany coast were another useful source and give an intimate glimpse into the lives and clothes worn by fashion-conscious middle-class people at the time, as do many of the autochromes in the collection at the Rijksmuseum. We've already seen John Trevor's portrait of his wife Caroline, and here she is again in an unusually intimate interior shot in which she is in déshabillé or undress, which would only be worn in the company of family in the home. Lastly, in this section, I include some really amazing examples of the British royal family, taken for publication in l'Illustration magazine at Buckingham Palace before they made a state visit to Paris in March 1914, just before the outbreak of the war. The Queen wears formal court dress with her orders and finest jewellery, including the Queen Consort's tiara that features the now contested Koh-i-Noor diamond, and this dress is recorded in her notebook at Kensington Palace, although sadly the maker of the dress is not. I'm also showing an autochrome from a private collection of the House of Paquin on the Rue de la Paix, decorated in preparation for the royal visit. Fashion in Motion continues the overview with a look at what younger, more active women were wearing during this period and how they reflected the relaxation of strict sartorial codes and their gradual emancipation. This is one of my favourite images in the whole book, an early autochrome by Alfred Stieglitz of a woman in sportswear, a white sweater and pleated flannel skirt, smoking a cigarette. She could be straight out of a 1980s advert for Ralph Lauren. The only thing that really dates her is the hairstyle and the fact that we know Stieglitz gave up on autochromes not long after their launch in 1907. The tailor-made was, an essential garment in the wardrobe of the so-called new woman. And this modernity is reflected not only in the clothes and the hair transitioning now into the short bob, but also the way that these looser, more comfortable garments allowed for more relaxed poses, depicting the way that fashion was actually worn and lived at the time. The increasing access to leisure pursuits and sport were, of course, important drivers of these changes, from a range of swimwear here on the left to the colourful knitwear worn by the Lartigue family and friends on the right. You can always tell when an image maker is interested in clothes, and in an interview, Lartigue even recalled how proud he was of his favourite orange sweater, which appears in another autochrome of a skiing party of Chamonix in 1914. Here at the bottom, he can be seen in the centre of the group on a bridge in a yellow cardigan with a white trim. Women and cars are popular subjects for autochromes at this period and appear frequently, perhaps reflecting the demographic of practitioners and their subjects. Here, Mrs. Bird poses in a striking hobble-skirted ensemble in front of a car in which her chauffeur waits in his dark green and blue livery. And that brought me to a discussion of with the imminent outbreak of the war, a discussion on uniforms, as here with the French tirailleurs, the colonial regiments in the French army, and these marine fusiliers at Dunkirk wearing their beautifully delineated corduroy trousers and serge sailors' smocks. Many autochromes were taken precisely because of the colourful nature of indigenous dress, not only in situ, as in the case of Kahn's Archives de la Planète, but also as it was appropriated into Western fashion, or indeed the reverse scenario, as Western fashion was assimilated into non-Western fashion systems. At the height of empire and colonial rule, many examples of Oriental dress, the Orient being at that time, as Edward Said put it, anywhere west of Suez, were brought back to Europe and worn guiltlessly as costume or fancy dress. Since the mid-19th century, of course, Japonism had gripped Europe, and ever since there had been a vogue for wearing kimono, often referred to as kimono mania. This garment, worn by Elsie Toodles Thomas in this well-known image by Alvin Langdon Coburn, has been described as a kimono, but it is in fact a Chinese changi. Travelling in the other direction, one might say, these dual heritage Vietnamese women, or métis, as Léon Boussy, one of Kahn's operatives, called them in the vernacular of the time, adopted Western styles in Hanoi, the capital of French colonial Tonkin, as it was called then. And I think you can really see the influence of Paul Poiret on the left here in this slightly earlier image. Similarly, this Afghani guardian on the left of a tomb in India wears what appears to be a coat made of scraps of Scottish tartan, an eclectic mix of styles or bricolage of the kind that John Galliano is so famous for and drew on in his first collection after leaving Central St. Martin's, which he called Afghanistan Repudiates Western Ideals. And I find this image completely fascinating. I think I could write a whole journal article on it, and would love to really research in depth the tartans. And also what fascinates me is that this coat is actually made up in 18th century style with the curved flat pockets and the deep cuffs and so on. So it poses many really interesting questions. As the great magpie collector of non-Western references in his collections, especially for Dior, his 2000, I'm talking about Galliano now, his 2002 collection drew upon Mongolian, or rather Khalkha, I think it's pronounced, dress. So this is where this history gets complicated. It's complicated territory and brings up many issues around cultural appropriation, the erasure of non-Western fashion systems, and so on. So I'm leaving this for another day and perhaps another book. More straightforward now is the discussion of costume, that is, clothes that are worn for performance. Paul Poiret has been called the first modern fashion designer, known for his colourful Orientalism, and is seen here on the left with his wife Denise at their 1002nd night party, influenced, of course, by the 1001 Tales of the Arabian Nights, for which he required the guests to don Oriental costumes, such as the ones designed by him on the right. He also commissioned Autochromes, probably from the Manuel Brothers studio, for advertising his Rosine perfumes and his Martin interior design atelier. And these two ateliers were named after his two daughters. He also designed fancy dress and theatre costume, and possibly some of these worn at this so-called Persian ball given by the Comtesse de Clermont-Tonnerre and photographed on the spot for l'Illustration magazine, probably by Debutin again for the Photo Couleur studio. The British equivalent of l'Illustration was, of course, the London Illustrated News, which also featured Autochrome spreads. And here the London fashion designer Lucile's so-called gowns of emotion, or gowns that express poetic ideas, as the title suggests, are worn with coloured wigs. And the very small caption at the top says that these images are untouched, instantaneous photographs, specially taken for the London Illustrated News by the polychrome process at the Dover Street studios. and the clothes are, of course, by permission of Madame Lucile. I also included some autochromes from a fabulous series taken a bit later by an unknown photographer of theatre or ballet costumes modelled by dancers from the collection of the Palais des Beaux-Arts in Lille. My last section is called Modernity and deals with fashion from 1919 to 1930, roughly, and begins with this great image by Mrs. Benjamin Russell again, a startlingly modern image of a young couple in casual clothing that wouldn't look out of place today. The autochromes in the Pegler collection at Bassetlaw Museum near Nottingham were useful in this section as they document the everyday clothing worn by his friends, family, neighbours and local people in Retford where he lived, country people in country tweeds, plus fours, jersey knits and sensible brogues. And Albert Kahn's portraits of the many visitors to his mansion in the suburbs of Paris also offered interesting images of clothes for this later period. The garçon look on the left, Margaret Farrand in a cubist scarf designed by Chanel, and the flamboyant dress of the Bohemian artist Fujita. And I finished this section with this autochrome of the Marquise Tokugawa visiting one of Kahn's 3 luxurious villas at Cap Martin, wearing the epitome of streamlined, coordinated 1930s modernist fashion. So back to the Salon du Goût Français. Finding this archive was like a detectorist finding gold, an incredible snapshot of the French fashion industry over a 3-year period at a time of change in fashion and technological advance. And happily, in 2023, at my instigation, the Palais Galliera in Paris mounted an exhibition that gave a sense of the original display and really allowed the beautiful redigitized autochromes to glow intensely from the darkened gallery. This was a thoroughly modern application of the autochrome, an exhibition that travelled in a trunk first to North America, and what we see here is the exhibition on display at the Wanamaker's flagship store in Philadelphia in the Egyptian Hall, where the autochromes are mounted in wooden partitions and arranged as if they were paintings in an art gallery. And this association with art, I think, is very important, particularly in terms of merchandising, particularly in America at the time, as well as, of course, colour, glass and light. And I talk about this quite a lot in the book. The following year, the Salon du Goût Français mounted a so-called crusade to the Far East on 2 decommissioned battle cruisers, a civilizing mission to underline the superiority of French taste and culture. You can see the route here on the left, down the Mediterranean, visiting French colonies on the way on the north and east coast of Africa, across to Australia, up through the Pacific, also visiting French colonies there, to China, Japan, Vietnam, Singapore, India, and then back again. And you can see the autochromes here being loaded onto one of the battle cruisers. And the arrival caused great excitement wherever it docked, as you can see in this report in the Sydney Morning Herald when it arrived in Australia. And the exhibition, these autochromes, the 2000 autochromes of the Salon, as I've already said, were mainly of fashion. The majority of them were of fashion from haute couture. So here, Poiret's sister, Nicole Gruer's design, which I paired up in the book with a surviving example of her work in the collection of the Musée des Arts Décoratifs, I spelled that wrong. And the Galliera in the exhibition found this cover of a fashion magazine called L'Art et la Mode, which they exhibited alongside this image. from haute couture to ready to wear in the form of sportswear, leisure wear, and these rather fetching silk house pajamas on the right. A plethora of accessories made by the satellite ateliers that supported the Parisian fashion industry. The Salon was an exercise, really, in confirming Paris as the center of the fashionable world. So my conclusion puts forward the notion, I have no idea how I'm doing for time, whether I've been too long or not long enough, but I'm concluding the book and the talk by saying that my conclusion puts forward the notion that despite John Wood's description of the Autochrome as imparting a nostalgic, rose-tinted version of history, an idyllic light, a lying light, as he says, because it gives the world a softness, a near shimmering it has never known. It was manufactured by the Lumieres using innovative technology and production methods, and was a key element of the chromatic modernism and booming consumer culture of the early 20th century. Of course, there are many problematic issues with the Autochrome. It was expensive and therefore mainly used or funded by well-heeled people or for commercial purposes. And most images reflect this Western privilege, not to mention the lack of diversity that is glaringly apparent, except in the colonial context. But for now, I suggest that the Autochrome changed the way people saw themselves, and my book is a celebration of this little-known, beautiful process that tells the story of Western fashion for the first time in reliable, vivid, and entrancing colour. Thank you.
Thanks, Cally. That was fascinating and so exciting to see so many beautiful and unknown autochromes, at least to my eyes anyway. If anyone has any questions, please drop them in the chat, and I'm going to kick off actually with a couple of my own. I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about how you selected those that you wanted to illustrate the points that you're making in the book, and how you went about that process.
I'm afraid I'm a bit chaotic. It took me a long time. I think the most difficult part of writing any book actually is formulating what you want to say into some kind of sensible order, as I'm sure lots of people here know. That is the most difficult thing. But of course, this is an image-led book, as most of my books are, in fact. And so really it's trying to give a chronology at the same time as exploring important themes during that period. So that's the difficulty. And really, it just takes a long time to find images that fit both of those requirements. That's all I can say. It's really a sort of a gut feeling, I suppose.
We're going to come to the chat in just a moment, but I'm just going to ask a follow-up really. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit. I suspect a lot of us in the audience are not particularly knowledgeable about fashion, and certainly not fashion historians. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about the importance of seeing colour for historians such as yourself, trying to understand about fashion. I mean, you touched on it partly in your presentation, but I wonder if you could just develop that a little bit further.
Yes, I was just, I mean, for me, this book was really important to write because I was just absolutely amazed that these had not really been ever used. As far as I know, I've only ever seen like one autochrome in a fashion history book up until now. And so that was really important. It's very difficult to address the question of the difference that it makes seeing these clothes in colour as opposed to seeing them in monochrome, because there is this weird thing that we have in our collective sort of memories, really, that history is in black and white. We're so conditioned, I think, to seeing history in black and white as through monochrome images. So there's something incredibly immediate about color. It's also really important to see that color was much more diverse, much brighter. You know, the fashion really was much more vibrant than perhaps we think of it. I think we just, you know, we dismiss the Edwardian era, the Belle Epoque, or the Gilded Age, whatever you like to call it, as being an era of, you know, these sweet pea colors that Poiret claimed that he had dismissed. But in fact, that wasn't true at all. And I think the autochrome, I hope, really challenges those assumptions and those stereotypes. You know, that sort of history that gets passed down and becomes a kind of urban myth, really, or sort of fashion myth that it's just not true. So what I'm hoping is that seeing these clothes in color at this very early period, and color that can be trusted as well, I think that's really important. You know, we can't trust paintings. I mean, John Singer Sargent, who was working at about the same time, changed the color of his sitters' clothes if they didn't fit his aesthetic requirements, his formal requirements for the painting. So we can't trust painting. We can't trust printed material because it was so clumsy, really, mostly certainly in the fashion press at the time, if there was any. So this is unique in its characteristic of being as reliable as it can be in representing color.
I'm just going to come back and pick up on that point, if I may, before we come to the questions in the chat. I just wonder then about how confident you are about trusting the autochrome, which obviously has its particular aesthetic and is prone over time to fading and color shift, or whether you have consciously gone and found the best possible examples to illustrate the points that you're making in the book.
Well, I have tried to show the best possible examples, obviously, and I think some of the ones that I've shown you tonight are pretty astonishing, you know, particularly the ones at the Musée des Arts Décoratifs, which is so sharp in focus. You know, that's another thing. We're told that the autochrome is is fuzzy, is hazy, impressionistic. But you look at those autochromes, which I did in real life at the museum, they're pin sharp. It's extraordinary. But to answer your question more directly, yes, obviously I tried to feature the best examples, but I think some of the damaged examples can be equally interesting. Um, when you say yes, I mean the color does tend to get saturated in some cases. There is damage or there are casts in other cases. But I think sometimes those are as interesting as perfect images. And so there are quite a few of them in the book. And we've kept in all of the most of the all of the damage and, you know, the history of the object as well, which I was quite insistent about.
Yeah, well, I think that brings us to our first question in the chat then from Diana, who's asking if you could just talk a little bit more about the backgrounds and props, which you consciously said you wouldn't do, but I think Diana certainly, and I think the rest of us would like to hear a little bit more about those as well.
Well, you know, I'd love to really follow this through actually, but I soon became aware that quite a lot of autochromes were taken in the same studio setting because there was the same painted backdrop, the same leopard skin rug on the floor, and the same cushions behind the subject. And there are at least, I would say, 10 of these in the book, which are not attributed to the Photo Couleur studio, but it's my assertion that that is where they were taken. So the Fortuny one was one example. I don't know if I can I go back?
You should be able to just yes, here we go.
Um, sorry, apologies, everybody.
That gives us another chance to see the wonderful images.
Where is it? There. You see? This is, well, it's not the leopard skin rug, it's the Persian rug, but this is the same painted backdrop, the same green cushions piled up behind, and you actually can just see the leopard skin rug here. Can you see that
Mm.
there? So I became obsessed by this because nobody ever said that these images were taken in the Couturiers studio. And I think that some of them were, that this studio was actually hired out to several different photographers, possibly. There may be people here who know an awful lot more about this than I do. But it was just something I became completely fascinated by. Um, and then there is another set of images where the same shiny red curtain is featured behind in nearly all of the images, and so that became a different studio that I haven't shown any examples of this evening. But it's just really interesting. Is that kind of sort of slightly, I don't know, hazardous empirical observation that you can make. Well, I hope that it's it's skilled observation, shall I say, or that there is some worth in it that just makes life more interesting, really.
Thank
And
you.
also, props like flowers and the same vases keep cropping up and the same bits of furniture and it's just the same bits of jewelry even in some of those images from Doucet, the models some of whom are supposed to be clients of his wearing their garments, possibly wearing the same necklace, for example. That kind of thing just makes it more interesting.
And we have two similar questions from Marion and Janine asking really whether you've been able to compare many of the autochromes that you found with original garments and how they compare, particularly in the context of the coloration.
Well, yes. Hi, Janine. That's a great question. Yes, I have. And I do think that in most cases they compare very well. I mean, for example, we saw the Nicole Gruot Autochrome as well as the surviving example. There are several in the Salon du Goût Français series that the Galliera and myself managed to match up with surviving garments. Several, actually, there was only one that was actually in the collection at the Palais Galliera, but they did find some others, as in the case of the Nicole Gruot dress at the Musée des Arts Décoratifs. What can I say? Yes, it's not exact. But then there are so many variables. There are variables in the way that the autochrome is viewed, in the way that it may be printed in printed media, and the light. Just the light that you're looking at it by. But yeah, I think they match up pretty well.
Thank
I'm
you.
going to say that anyway.
We've got a question from Claire. Firstly, thanking you for the presentation and for showing some wonderful images. And she's then following up by asking, are there further collections that you know of that are waiting to be digitized?
Oh, not that I know of that are waiting to be just digitized. Although, the collection at Bassett Law hasn't been digitized. I mean, that would be a wonderful one to do. The collection that I would really like to access, and if anybody here knows how I can access it, please let me know. My email is on the last slide. Is the archive at the National Geographic in Washington. I don't know what's happened to that archive. National Geographic was bought by Disney several years ago, and nobody seems to know that how you can access now. I mean, they've got something like 12,000 autochromes in that archive, and I would dearly love to be able to get access to it. So that's one that I'm after, Claire. Thank you.
Okay, we move on to our next. So Louisa's asking, well, firstly, again, thanking you for the presentation, and then asking, did your selections include examples of similar color processes that were around at the same time, such as Omnicolor and Dioptichrome? And if so, she wondered whether you had any observations about color comparisons between the different processes.
No, it was an embarras de richesse. I felt that I had enough material just with the autochrome, and I felt safe with the autochrome too. You know, I'm not a photo historian. I don't really know much about the technology of photography. It was the fact that the autochrome was taken with an internal technology that couldn't be changed, like a Polaroid, that was really important to me. And there was no sort of um, separation process. You know, I mean, I just felt safe with the autochrome, and I felt that I didn't have the knowledge really to go into other processes, and I felt that I had enough. Beautiful as some of the other processes can be, um, but the autochrome was enough.
We've got a questions from Tegan, which is maybe perhaps a little bit technical based on what you've just said. Just asking whether you could say little bit about the challenges of displaying autochromes and other very specific environmental requirements.
Hi Tegan, are you my Tegan? My ex-student Tegan. Um,
Yes, he is.
oh, she,
Um,
fabulous. It's so nice you're here. Yeah, I don't think they're that difficult to display, you know, because the Albert Kahn Museum, which digitized their incredible collection really early on, from the 1990s onwards, um, has absolutely no qualms about, you know, reproducing them, enlarging them, mounting them on light boxes in their displays and so on. They've since kind of revamped their display. I mean, if you want to see how to display autochromes in an up-to-date fashion, you should pay the museum a visit because they've done some amazing stuff with digital technology now, of course. But I don't think I don't think there is a massive problem about exhibiting them. Obviously, the originals are difficult to display because they're small and they're very prone to damage. And not many places would actually put an original autochrome on display for any length of time now, anyway. So they have to be reproduced. So you can't really be snooty about not displaying an original, I think. And I think that sort of worry is, or that concern, or that criterion is now something that from the past, really. You have to be looking at reproduction. I just
um,
I hope
Tegan,
hope I answered your question,
yeah.
Tegan.
And there is quite a lot of literature from the conservation world on autochromes and their stability and advice about reproduction and display. So we can direct you there if that's something you want to follow up. I think that brings us to the end of our questions. Lots of very complimentary comments about the presentation, so thank you. And I'd encourage people to get Cally's book, which is The Colour of Clothes by Thames and Hudson, which has just been published. It's looks wonderful from some of the social media posts that Cally's put out, and I'm still waiting for my copy to turn up. So I'd encourage you to go out and seek that in your local independent bookshop or directly from Thames and Hudson's website. So, Cally, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and for sharing those wonderful images with us all this evening. And thank you to our audience for staying with us. And there's a comment just come in from Louisa saying that she might have a contact at National Geographic for you. So could you just go to your final slide with your email address
Yes,
on?
yes, yes. What a fantastic result. I did try and access in 2018 when I was on a research trip over there But it was like trying to get into Fort Knox. I hope I'm not speaking out of turn here, but I just could not, even though I knew the name of one of the curators, I just couldn't get into it. Oh, sorry.
It's gone past it.
It's gone right. There we are.
There we go. So
Can you
it's
see that,
C
Louisa?
Blackman at csm.arts.ac.uk.
Yeah.
You can always email us and we'll share that with you, Louisa. Great.
Thank you so much. That would be
Yeah.
absolutely
And in
amazing.
fact, Jonathan is also saying that he might have a contact at Disney, so we'll be in contact also. So looks like there might be a couple of potential avenues. So again, thank you, Cally, so much for sharing your knowledge and for telling us about the book. And thank you to our audience as well for your questions this evening. Look out for future talks looking at other collections of historical photography coming up by the RPS's historical group. We'll send links through to the upcoming talks and also some live events, including a visit to the John Rylands Library. Thank you, everyone, and good evening.